this week on MSNBC, host Joe Scarborough gave a familiar speech about the dangers of Donald Trump wielding government power against his political opponents. With figures like Letitia James, James Comey, and John Bolton finally facing charges, the left has quickly rediscovered their love for judicial restraint. Scarborough delivered his tirade with nods of approval from other journalists as he warned that Trump and his administration officials would face a similar set of politically motivated prosecutions once they were out of power. The obvious problem being that the Democrats already brought those charges against Trump and his staff. The left is attempting to engage in political amnesia in hopes of selling a program of political de-escalation which they have no intention of taking part in. The classic argument about the centralization or use of power in American politics is that it should be avoided because eventually it will be turned on you when your party is out of power. The case is simple and persuasive, but it comes with some assumptions built in. The argument is based on the idea that the lines have not already been crossed, that both sides are still squarely playing on a field of objective political order. Neither party wants to step off the field to gain a momentary advantage because the cost of their opponents adopting the same strategy would be too great. But what happens to that argument if one side has already clearly transgressed those rules and stepped squarely off the playing field? It becomes far more difficult to convince your opponent to avoid using a strategy that you regularly deploy yourself. For a long time, liberals were able to contain conservatives, and frankly, conservative leaders were able to contain the larger right wing by preaching about the dangers of political escalation. Republicans were, at least in theory, the party of small government. They feared the accumulation or exercise of power in almost every area, and the prosecution of political opponents was no exception. This is why most conservatives stood awestruck as they watched the very people who had told them for decades that no political prosecution should ever take place arrest protesters, administration officials, and even the president himself. One of the reasons that warnings against political escalation are so effective is that the spiral is hard to escape. Once one side has violated the norms, the other side must reciprocate or invite further abuse at the hands of their opponents. But just like a real fight, once blows and counterblows have been thrown, it's very difficult to call a truce. Both sides recognize that once violence has been deployed, one party must win by taking violence back off the table. It's very difficult to reestablish an equilibrium and restore order, which is why it's best to never enter into the spiral in the first place. Democrats have their justifications, of course. Trump is a once-in-a-generation threat, a proto-dictator who embodies all the worst impulses of middle America. When faced with that kind of threat, the system must make an example of this dangerous fascist, or his brand of politics will become normalized. At some level, the left knew it was opening Pandora's box by prosecuting a former president and his officials, but they were so desperate to punish their foes that Democrats simply convinced themselves that the consequences would never materialize. Now that the shoe's on the other foot, they have no real argument to stand on. Progressives recognize at some level that they've painted themselves into a rhetorical corner, but there's no way that they'll ever admit it. Democrats are predictably upset, but they've already deployed every one of these legal strategies that they're now complaining about against their own political opponents. Now they're forced to deploy some kind of strange version of political amnesia, pretending that the last 8 years just never took place. The president was never convicted on a pile of manufactured charges. Administration officials were never put under arrest. Meme makers and protesters were never incarcerated. Be careful about jailing your political opponents because they might jail you rings a little hollow when your political opponents have already put you in prison. In truth, the gamble the Democrats took was relatively safe. Republican politicians are spineless cowards as a rule. Despite regular violations of political norms by the left, they're rarely if ever held accountable for their action. Yes, the nakedly political prosecutions against Trump were an unprecedented escalation, but Democrats were sure that the imbalanced dynamic would hold. What they didn't consider is that Trump's not a typical GOP politician. The billionaire holds a grudge, and he doesn't like to lose. If you give him an opportunity to settle the score, he will. It's now clear that even in this moment where the political pendulum has swung decisively to the other side, the Democrats have learned nothing. Politicians and pundits on the left consider every action taken against Trump and his staff to be legitimate. The warnings against political retribution ring hollow, but empty words are all the progressives have left. They disturbed the equilibrium. Retribution was always going to come due, and now all they can really do is make insincere appeals to procedural normalcy and hope that spineless conservatives capitulate. Again, honestly, not the worst bet to make. It's worked out for them before. In truth, the real battle for the left has moved from the realm of politics to the realm of the streets. Having lost the last election against a man that you sold as the next Hitler, Democrats are totally out of rhetorical options. Where do you go after calling your opponents Nazis who plan to enslave women and murder minorities? How do you communicate an escalation in urgency when you've already turned your opponents into secular Satan? This is why the left has settled on violence as their political weapon of choice. If you declare Trump Hitler and the country votes for Hitler, how can you continue to embrace the electoral process? The answer is that you don't, and that's why the left has now embraced terrorism instead. Thanks for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, go ahead and click like. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time to do so. If you'd like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. And when you do, please leave a rating or review. It really helps with the algorithm magic. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter or Substack or Instagram, if you'd like to watch these videos on Rumble or Odyssey, the links to do all of that are down below in the description. Of course, you can watch all of my shows and read all of my columns over at The Blaze. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll talk to you next time.